There is something magical about fiction, the influence that it has on us, the stories, the meaning, the ideas extrapolated from substance and subtext. Some works of fiction can be prolific or have the foresight to look into the future, whilst others can be introspective on the present or the past. Whether it's your favorite movie, anime, book, video game, there is a message, an idea, and there is some particular feeling or influence that this piece of work has on the perception of the world and the way we perceive that world. Metaphor ReFantazio tells a story that explores and promotes the ideas that fiction can project into the world and how fiction can provide a sense of hope and influence to build a better world. What's more interesting is the influence that fiction and fantasy has had on Atlus as a studio, given their history predominantly with stories that take place in a contemporary setting and this whole new venture out into the world of fantasy. Metaphor ReFantazio is in many respects, when it was first revealed and teased, was meant to be a reproach for Katsura Hashino and the writing team to rethink and reimagine fantasy, and in almost every respect, I do believe that they have succeeded in that quest. Metaphor ReFantazio is an incredible RPG that tells a captivating story that carries a strong sense of weight and a strong amount of themes and substance, and overall has an interesting cast of characters, a strong gameplay and combat system that combines the best elements of SMT and Persona into one incredible game that is wrapped up in its own new set of fresh ideas, blending together a great and incredible RPG and something that feels fresh, new and exciting. It is an incredible feat for Atlus and Studio Zero and overall for games in 2024. It never ceases to feel meaningful in how it asks the player to utilize their time, and in turn, it provides the player with countless things to do, making this 80-hour venture feel like it just will go by in a blink of an eye. There is a robust and customizable approach to combat, and the new archetype system shakes up the way the game handles progression in a way that feels flexible but strategic for players who choose to maneuver their fights. The world of Ukraine is rich and full of history and conflict, and it shines through every facet of this game and is an absolute masterpiece and statement that Atlus are at the top of their game with this, and no matter the setting, the style of type of game they try to make, they really do just aim for the stars and ultimately deliver in most cases. It should be no surprise to you by this point that I loved Metaphor ReFantazio, and I really do think this is a strong contender for the game of the year, and I think that this is one game that if you are tossing up of what to play this year, this is definitely one worth checking out, and I'm here to tell you throughout this video why and just how excellent this game is. So without further ado, let's get into my review for Metaphor ReFantazio. Before I dive into the nitty-gritty of the different aspects of Metaphor ReFantazio's contents, I believe that it is important to touch on the game's development, as it is a big part of what brought this experience to life. The ideas and concepts that shaped this game from its early stages carry across to the final product in ways I feel do provide some context to Metaphor's importance and what it achieves. The development for Metaphor ReFantazio kicked off shortly after the Japanese release of Persona 5 back in 2016. Katsura Hashino, who was the creative lead behind the modern Persona games and cult classics like SMT3 Nocturne, made the choice to step back from these established franchises and start up a new studio called Studio Zero under the Atlus umbrella to take on a new game entirely. Hashino wanted to pivot towards a more fantasy-leaning RPG with the name Project ReFantazio. Hashino explained his intentions were to create an RPG that was rooted in the aesthetics of a traditional fantasy. The concept of a fantasy was a major discussion point during the game's development, and they wanted to bring across many of these ideas from their contemporary backdrops into this modern setting. These ideas found themselves re-emerge in a different lens and a different type of idea and backdrop that was that of fantasy. With this, Studio Zero's attempts to start a new studio and break away from the worlds of Persona and SMT led them to dabble into the world of fantasy, seeking the inner workings of Metaphor's narrative. And this plays into many of their major themes, such as the worlds of fiction and how fiction and reality share this parallel between each other and their sense of ideals and how they differ and contrast between one another. And this would just further flesh itself out, and in a way, have this conversation and dialogue between the worlds that the studio has created prior to Metaphor and Metaphor's release, and kind of distinguish the two as two different sets of work. Hoshino would bring with him many of the talent from Peace Studios, such as the veterans like Shoji Meguro, the mind behind the music for Persona 3 through 5 and many different SMT titles, and Shinganori Sojima, the character designer for various SMT entries and art director for Persona 3 through 5. There was countless talent here to work on this game, and it seems like much of those ideas and world building and character, soundtrack and design all just carried across here into Metaphor, and it shows. And with a team of veterans that have worked on these style of games and these types of games, tackling something new and ambitious that brings a lot of the old into something new, this game really had the trappings of a successful new entry. The story for Metaphor ReFantazio takes place in the fantastical world of Uchronia that is comprised of 8 major tribes and is engulfed in turmoil, fear, anxiety and divide. With the death of Uchronia's king, the world is on the verge of a new dawn as the race for a new king emerges, and one that will be selected based on the favor and demand of the people. Metaphor puts you in the shoes of a player named Traveler who is set out on a journey accompanied by his fairy handler Gallica to rescue the prince, the protagonist's childhood friend and rightful heir to the throne, who has been stricken with an ill-fated curse. Metaphor's story unfolds with many plot threads, telling an exceptional globe-trotting adventure across the world of Uchronia to protect the throne and save the prince. Metaphor's journey, exploration, and world building in many ways harken back to the JRPGs of old, with unique cities, cultures, and wildlife that make this universe incredible to get invested into and really bring the world to life, and in so many different ways does it deliver on this. In terms of time to complete its story and how it presents its story, it's still an Atlus game and it'll run you around 80 hours to see it to its conclusion, but trust me, every second is worth it, and if you are not invested by the time you finish the demo and the story that it has to offer there, I doubt that it'll really hook you in later on. But thankfully, I think for most people, this is a really enthralling game and one that is so easy to hook you in and get you invested. That's the story overview from a non-spoiler standpoint, but now I would like to discuss the themes for Metaphor ReFantazio, because there is some in this game that I really think are brilliant and just so great that I just need to talk about it. So if you're someone who's coming to just check this review out and you finish the game, this part's for you, because I won't be spoiling anything major with the plot points of the story, but I will be talking about some story beats and the way that it ties into major themes, and I think those themes might spoil some aspects. So you're welcome to come back to this part of the review once you finish the game, and if you want to avoid those spoilers, and I'll put a timestamp here for where you can skip to avoid any story related spoilers. Theme and underlining threadline of Metaphor ReFantazio's narrative explores the ideas and concepts revolving around power, and it also dives into the concept of how those who wield power can choose and dictate change. There are many aspects of power that are called into question throughout Metaphor, many different ways, and that this concept and idea of power can even be perceived. On a major side note here, I think that one thing that Metaphor does really well is it reshapes and recontextualizes something from the Shin Megami Tensei series, and that is the idea of these two major forces and ends of ideals being through the lens of law and chaos. I think that Metaphor does it fairly differently here, but there are two major parties and two major sets of ideals, both with their own set of flaws, that being the Sanctum, this like lawful religious group that has like a theocratic reign over the city and is striving to rule over the whole kingdom, and then there is the side of chaos, which is the ideals set by Metaphor's primary antagonist. There are two of these major parties that have their two differing views split on either extreme, with our protagonist's set of ideals falling straight down the middle. What are these ideals? Well, that leads me to the centerpiece of this theme and the major aspect here of power, and that is the major threadline that ties all of Metaphor's themes together, and that is the power that fiction wields and the power of fiction of itself, and how these stories of fiction can drive and influence change in our reality. The main party finds their source of power through ideas conveyed through fiction, ideas that can spur hope in people. Throughout Metaphor's lengthy story, there is one key word that you will hear repeatedly, and it is intentional in its design as to why you'll hear this word, and that word is Utopia. And trust me, we'll be talking about that in greater depth shortly. This word utopia, this book that fantasizes and ponders on a better, idealistic world, is the party's source of belief and the world and ideal that they fight for. From the moment the prince shared with our protagonist this fable of a world that is thrived and as a utopia, the power of fiction took hold, and the depiction of a world free from discrimination, divide, class segregation would be fought for to become a reality. However, this lofty ideal of a world that is a utopia, whilst is the fuel for hope and for a better world, there is a question that is a perfect world even attainable? Fiction, even if unattainable, can be a source of power that can carry a message, and even if unattainable in practicality, can inspire and motivate those to become stronger and fight back against their fears and anxieties, something else we will touch on shortly. The depiction of fantasy and what we take from a story is something that the power of fiction carries. The way that we can perceive the message and how we choose to shape our story in this world based off the ideals of fiction is all in our hands. From the early stages of Metaphor ReFantazio's development, there was one key word that echoed throughout devising the narrative and overall setting for Metaphor, and that was utopia. The concept of utopia makes several appearances throughout the narrative and is used to explore the dissonance between an ideal world, a fantasy world, and the real world. It ponders and asks the question, are such goals of achieving equality attainable? It depicts the contrast between an ideal world, a fantasy, and reality, providing introspection on ourselves and our reality through the view of a fantasy, a utopia. The book the traveler and the prince find their source of influence and idealism from is from your Velvet Room equivalent companion who resides in a realm called Academia, named Moore. This character's name bears some significance as one of the early modern humanists who was well known for his writings named Utopia bared the same name. This idealistic conquest for a utopia is juxtaposed brilliantly to the world of Uchronia, a world that is engulfed in racial prejudice, class discrimination, and malevolent theocrats. During the development of Metaphor, Hoshino and the writing team took to various perspectives of topics revolving around justice and took those reasons into consideration and wanted to cultivate a world where the characters did not adhere to strict values of morality. This would allow the team to deviate from their clear-cut characters of virtue that were established in things like the Persona series. With this ability to deviate from a clear-cut concept of morality, it would allow the team to expose the values of what people believe and explore the subjective nature of one's perception of a utopia. This is portrayed by various candidates. Although some may be comedic in intention, they are all representative of a different view or perspective of a better world. Some examples being a world built on aesthetics and beauty, a world governed by religion, or the people who value the lives of the wildlife. And you start to see these different ideals that aren't representative of everybody, and in some respects may be such a selfish perception of a utopia. And to me, it asks and begs the concept of, is a perfect world truly attainable? Is a utopia something that is an objective matter of fact or something that is subjective? And if it is subjective, is that something that we can all really agree on and define? I think that this is something that comes across really well in the game, and I think Metaphor does a really great job of tackling this concept of utopia and posing the question of what is a perfect world, and it pulls more from our first theme of taking our ideals from a concept of a better world, but not striving and understanding that it may not be something that is fully attainable. So here we are at the third and final core pillar of Metaphor ReFantazio's themes, and that is anxiety. This is the last major theme that I would like to talk about in this video. The concept of anxiety is used to depict control, what has a stranglehold over people. Anxiety is a big, major antagonist in this game. It holds people back, preventing them from moving forward towards that better future and their ambitions, their goals. And whilst our world may never end up as a utopia, anxiety is the alternative, the flip side, the inverse of this. It breeds fear and leads to destruction. Metaphor on a symbolic level shares a similar characteristic to the Persona series in how it handles the player's awakening to their new power. Where there is a pact that the protagonist in the Persona series is making is tied to the central theme of that particular game, Metaphor's theme will see the party member awaken to a power of the archetype through ripping out their heart, abandoning their fears, uncertainties, insecurities, and making a pact to confront anxiety. And this violent and graphic depiction is a statement of the the separation of their resolve and anxiety, that commitment to walk forward and persevere. Many look at Metaphor and see this political melodrama, which is very much the surface level of what Metaphor is. On a more micro level, it is exploring the unrest and the inner anxieties of the people, and asks in this world what a true leader is and what a good and prosperous king would build. And through our protagonist, it explores the idea of building bridges amongst these different tribes and seeing not differences but common ground, similarities, and embracing the differences that different tribes hold. The team has created these different tribes to explore that idea of how people clash, how different people from different experiences collide, and how these inabilities to coexist perpetuate the feelings of anxiety. The theme of anxiety is served to play an inverse role to the concept of the idealistic worlds of a utopia. The ideals of a utopia are designed to breathe hope, optimism, and a world where people have resolve to move forward. Anxiety is something that serves to leave the people struck in place, and a world where people are lost and ultimately at the core premise are fighting against this adventure, this sense of hope and striving towards a better future. Metaphor ReFantazio ultimately is a game that is rich with subtext like many of the Persona and SMT games, and I would like to dive more deeper into it later on in the future, but for now I want to move on with this review. And if you've watched this far, thank you for listening and hearing me out on my impressions on what the game was really about. Anyways, on to the next section. Metaphor ReFantazio's combat is primarily focused around turn-based encounters, and it inherits more of its foundations from SMT with turn actions, which are a number of actions afforded to the player. When exploiting an enemy's weakness in Metaphor, this gives and refunds the player an action point, allowing them to make another move. For those jumping into Metaphor from Persona, hitting an enemy's weakness doesn't stun the enemy, nor does Metaphor have things like all-out attacks. However, Metaphor's combat in many ways feels more tactical and does offer up its own unique alternative with this in mind. Another addition here in Metaphor that breaks the tradition from other Atlus games is there is no game over if the protagonist is KO'd in combat, which I personally do welcome. Overall, if you've played an Atlus RPG before, whether it be Persona or SMT, you'll be familiar with many of the core pillars of combat, and the overall approach to turn-based combat is intuitive and engaging throughout the experience. And with all that in mind, Metaphor ReFantazio doesn't only retread and recontextualize existing components of combat, but also introduces new mechanics to spice up the combat through the use of synthesis skills. These skills are group attacks which each party member can use when they team up with another party member and execute a more powerful attack. Synthesis skills will require more action points from the party. However, similarly to how when exploiting weaknesses you are refunded player actions, the same rule here is applicable when using synthesis skills. There are over 50 different types of synthesis skills that you can see in this game that can be used, and they come with their own animation and eye melting and are oozing with style, similar to Showtime attacks from Persona 5 and your other types of attacks that you would see in our more modern Atlus games, but they are bespoke to each particular archetype, and we'll discuss more later in the video what archetypes are and what role they play, but synthesis skills are ultimately derived from these different types of archetypes. And inclusive of all of these different types of returning and new variables, there is another aspect which makes a return from many old school RPGs, and that is the use of party formation, which will allow the player to assemble their party into two different rows, the front row and the back row. And this adds another element of strategy because based on the archetype and the spells or abilities you have available, there's different areas on the battlefield where you will want to place your character. If you have a more melee focused character, you might want to put them in the front row. A more mage or caster type of character may be more beneficial in the back row. And the reason why you'd want to strategically place your characters is because front row allows that party member to deal more damage, but in turn take more damage, whereas the back row would allow more projectile based characters to still deal a decent amount of damage, but at the same time take less damage. It makes for an interesting way to strategize what types of skills and classes your party members have equipped and which formations are best approached for each encounter. And it really does make you want to experiment with both what types of archetypes and spells you have available, along with the different types of party formations and party members you have available to you. The next thing that I think is a really nice inclusion and really does differentiate Metaphor from many of its contemporary turn-based RPGs is this thing I call free flow combat. One of the biggest issues that many who try to get into these turn-based RPGs face is, well, the turn-based combat, but more explicitly, the repetition of that combat and how things like random encounters and the turn-based repetition of it just randomly always walking into an encounter and these mindless ones as well can really wear down the experience. Metaphor's approach is to lower level enemies in particular a great way to spruce up this action, and it really does accomplish this through this free flow basic melee combat where you can just attack enemies and just button mash this one button and effortlessly you can just like hack away at these different enemies, and it doesn't initiate a turn-based encounter and it removes the kind of tedious nature of these encounters. I think it's great because you can go into a dungeon and still collect all the goodies, and you can still have this sense of small incremental progression against some of the weaker enemies, and it doesn't make it feel like you're just breezing through and having to do the same encounter over and over again that takes away an extra minute of your time. This mode of combat makes re-exploring those old dungeons and facing those enemies under your level something that you can really engage with and removes all the tedious nature and draining of resources as well. And I think it's an aspect of these games that I really do feel is a big turnoff for many people, and I think Metaphor handles this extremely well. It does really move away a lot of that fatigue that people can find and keeps many of its dungeons feeling refreshing, and the encounters where enemies are above your level still always remain challenging. So anytime you are in a turn-based encounter, you are fighting someone who is on equal footing with the player. Another thing that this aspect of combat provides for enemies that are at the same player's level is abilities to stagger the enemy, which will kick off a turn-based encounter with your party in an advantaged state, allowing them to attack first and even having a party member attack the enemy before combat is even initiated. However, on the flip side, these enemies will attack and chase you. If they land a hit on you, they will throw your party into a disadvantaged state of combat and land an attack on you first. It really does make this free flow aspect of combat really something fun that keeps the player engaged and alert no matter what dungeon they are exploring, as an enemy on your level can appear at any time. And I think that this is a great thing that Metaphor really does execute on, and I'd love to see how this type of combat is implemented in future Atlus games. The exploration for Metaphor ReFantazio follows the same formula and structure to that of the Persona series, where the game will offer the player a main dungeon that needs to be completed and explored within a given deadline. However, on the side there will be plenty of activities to take part in that can level up all aspects of the character's progression. These main dungeons, however, are all unique, interesting, and are the bread and butter of this experience. And what they will be doing is providing versatile approaches to how they can be completed, with some of them feeling really different and distinct in both their visual presentation and even with some of them in how they're completed. And I think that is really great for an 80-hour plus game. But it isn't just this means of exploring dungeons, there is also the time management system, which is where you can really feel the Persona influence. So the time management system, much like Persona, runs on that day and night clock, and it'll provide similar mechanics such as royal virtues, which are your social stats, your bonds, which are your social links, and other interesting little unique activities that take part in the world of Uchronia. And what I think is really great here is the fact that Metaphor, being a fantasy game, allows these activities to really help build and flesh out this fantastical world. Where Persona took place in a more contemporary, realistic kind of setting, they were kind of grounded with the things that they could do with the social aspects of this game, whether it's going to eat burgers or taking on a part-time job. But I think here in Metaphor, they can really go all out with the different types of activities that they have. And there's a lot of different things here that I think can do a little bit of little subtle world building and little things here that can really expand upon the tribes, their cultures, and things like the Sanctum, and provide a bit more context if you go looking for it. I think that these are great aspects, and this area of the game really does complement the other side of the dungeon exploration really well. And for those who aren't familiar with how these systems work and have never played a Persona game before, I will talk about how these game progression systems really do feed into the overall gameplay and combat loop well in the next section. But the last aspect of exploration that I would like to discuss is how Metaphor ReFantazio handles side dungeons and requests. And I think that it executes it really well. This approach to side content, especially these side dungeons, I would argue that this is one aspect of the experience that is handled way more tactfully than I would say a Persona game handles their side content, and I'm happy to explain how. You see, in Metaphor, as you settle into each of the game's major cities, you'll have various dungeons that open up for you to complete, either through bounties or requests that are given to you by various people you'll run into. These dungeons are interesting and varied in their visual presentation, the types of puzzles and labyrinth type structure that they are designed to be, but more importantly, I feel the variation of these smaller dungeons really does break up and differentiate the gameplay experience and provides a greater sense of breadth to the exploration in a way that only feels possible in the setting and world that Metaphor lends itself to. I think that these dungeons here in Metaphor feel a lot more memorable than the comparison to Mementos or Tartarus in something like Persona, where they can become very labyrinth-like but very repetitive in their design, their structure and look. I think these different dungeons here in Metaphor feel like they're more smaller and bite-sized for sure, but more memorable and varied. I can remember many of the towers and dungeons that I've explored in Metaphor and their distinct design than particular floors and sections of Mementos, and I'll just leave it at that. But I think that this approach to side content really does make side quests and these dungeons feel a lot more memorable and tied to particular parts of this experience, and it's something that I think is a real highlight. Now I'd like to talk about archetypes, which are the key and core driver of progression that becomes more and more expansive as you progress through the game. If you are familiar with SMT or Persona, then you'll be familiar with the style of monster collector gameplay present in those games, where you are collecting stronger demons and fusing them to make more formidable party composition that can exploit enemy weaknesses, buff the party and debuff the enemy. I bring this comparison to the forefront because whilst Metaphor may be on the surface looks similar with these cool archetypes that cast similar spells and exploit enemy weaknesses to get an advantage, it is fundamentally and foundationally how archetypes are obtained and operate that is entirely different in its manner and form to demons or personas. Archetypes are, in their most simplest form, operating like a class or a job from many traditional RPGs. Where archetypes differ is in their flexibility and in their evolution. See, every party member is able to access every single archetype, and through mastery of a particular archetype provides access to the next evolution of that respective lineage of the archetype. But some classes will have a prerequisite of mastering a certain set of archetypes, rewarding and incentivizing players to explore many different playstyles that are available. Some examples of this is how mastering the wizard archetype will enable a party member to explore the magic knight, which has this combination of mastering the knight lineage as well as the mage lineage. And once you have these two prerequisites, you can then combine them together and have this next evolution, which is the magic knight. It provides a more expansive set of playstyles that merge together and reward the player for exploring different avenues and different lineages. And it also provides the player the ability to equip different inherited skills from all these different classes, making you dabble with being a healer, being a mage, being a knight, being paladin, or being even a ninja, doing all these different types of things. You can just master all these different types of classes if you want to invest your time. Another feature that expands the way you interface with these archetypes is, like I was talking about, how you are able to inherit different skills you've unlocked across the archetypes you've been mastering. You can assign these skills to your current archetypes that you have equipped from any prior archetypes that you may have unlocked, meaning you can take advantage of different skills from different archetypes and apply them accordingly. The progression of archetypes is something that we'll dive more into how it works later, but essentially the way these archetypes work ties into this social aspect of the things that you'll be doing on your day-to-day. So think of those social links that you would find in a Persona game that are referred to as followers and bonds here in Metaphor, and this is the key to progressing and leveling up the overall lineage of a particular archetype. And what better time than any is it now to talk about the followers? So I would like to probably discuss how follower bonds in Metaphor ReFantazio operate, and they are similar to the social links that are found in the Persona series. The way that a bond works here in Metaphor is a multifaceted answer. First and foremost, they serve as a sub-story that will introduce a character of interest that dives into a particular sub-theme of Metaphor's narrative. These stories are divided into 8 parts, and when completing each iteration of these characters' story, you'll strengthen your bond with this particular character who is tied to a particular archetype lineage, and in turn that will strengthen both the narrative level of your progression with this character, and in turn on a gameplay level unlock new perks and abilities tied to that particular lineage, meaning you'll unlock new inheritance slots, where you can have up to 4 new evolutions for this particular archetype, as well as new little benefits like being able to get discounts at shops and things of this nature that factor into the equation, meaning no matter who you are spending time with and when, you are always effectively improving and growing, as well as getting to explore more of the content on offer and dive more into the themes of this game's story. This is something that I feel like the Persona series has always been able to manage so gracefully, and it is something that I feel Metaphor is able to do exceptionally too. I would argue there is less free time overall in Metaphor compared to Persona, but what makes Metaphor do this so well is the way that it concentrates and curates this content into a more compact version of that more expansive Persona experience, and it feels tight, rewarding, and satisfying. If you spend time with a follower, you will strengthen that bond and you will receive a progression benefit. You explore a dungeon, you level up, you unlock new gear and rewards, and you overall will be enhancing this experience. And when you aren't spending time with your followers or exploring a dungeon, you'll be taking part in these other activities that I touched upon earlier in the review. So overall, you'll have your main dungeons, side dungeons, your followers, but then there is this other part of the social experience. These things that will increase your overall characteristics and your character's way that they interact with the world. In Persona, they're referred to as social stats, but here in Metaphor, they are referred to as your royal virtues, all the habits and qualities that a king must entail. These royal virtues are divided into 5 categories of things, such as courage, eloquence, imagination, and there's 2 others as well. And increasing these virtues can provide you access to partake in different activities, but it also can be a barrier to progressing various bonds that you will want to progress. Say you don't have high enough tolerance to really understand what someone's going through, you will need to spend time raising your tolerance before you can progress that social link. These royal virtues ultimately will intersect with how you engage with various activities that are available, and in some respects, they're a soft skill check to unlocking and completing different aspects of Metaphor's content. You'll need to effectively manage the allotted time that you have to upskill your eloquence before you can converse with a particular bond, or have enough courage to take part in a particular activity. Where in Persona you'll be visiting a restaurant or working part-time, I feel the activities in Metaphor do provide an interesting backdrop to the culture, politics, and local festivities of the different places that you visit and the different regions. And I think that this is a nice change of pace. And overall, all these activities that are on offer in Metaphor really are just incredible, because I think, and I've said this before, it is a great use of the time management system, and it does feel tight and compact, and it really does serve as a nice way to flesh out and detail the world of Uchronia in a way that I feel is very distinct and different to how Atlus have handled this in the past. Now I would like to talk about the visual and sound presentation for Metaphor ReFantazio, which is stylistically stunning, with Atlus being able to create some truly incredible cities, landscapes, and societies. And with the game now not having the restraints of being grounded in a modern day setting, it feels like the team has been given full reign to just let loose and create something that is absolutely incredible and grounded in this world of fantasy where the chains have been released and they're able to make something truly magical. And with someone like Shinjinori Sojima returning to do the character designs, it is no surprise how each of these party members, races, and characters look so incredible. Not to mention how incredibly distinct and crazy these enemy designs are, drawing influences from the surrealistic artworks of Hieronymus Bosch. And every time you encounter a boss in this game, you'll absolutely be at awe at the size and scale and overall presentation of these enemies. It is seriously something to behold, and something that feels very different in terms of its art direction, style, and characteristics that Atlus is known for. The easiest thing to acknowledge that everyone would have seen as a standout since that first trailer of the game dropped is the UI for this game. Whether it is increasing your bond with a party member, selecting the choices that you want to make during combat, or pausing the game for a moment of respite, the visual presentation is oozing with style, but it is comprehensive still in a way that doesn't distract from its functionality. Seriously, this game's universe is brought to life in every facet of its presentation. The 8 different tribes are all distinct in their presentation, and the way they are represented reflects accurately in their place within the world. The menus are so beautiful, and they just ooze with style, and they just come out and bring the personality of this game to life. The enemy designs are so different and terrifying in their own way. They feel like this amalgamation of person and creature. It is such a crazy visual game to just take in that sometimes it feels like an overload. And the other side of this equation, the sound, in no way is held back either, with the OST seeing a return of the amazing amazing composer that is Shoji Meguro as lead composer for the score and soundtrack here, man, it is a huge departure from the acid jazz inspired bops of Persona 5 or the electronic metal blends of SMT4, but with a more fantastical soundtrack that is versatile from whimsical or introspective to more triumphant and ominous. These chanting pieces that make these battle themes are incredible, and Metaphor's soundtrack is fantastic. It is different and it will take some getting used to. I think that the closest comparison that I can really think of in comparing Metaphor's soundtrack is another Atlus game that was also done by Meguro, which was Strange Journey. At the same time here, I think there is something truly special about this soundtrack here in Metaphor ReFantazio. It really does tap into a lot of different sound, and I think it's very different and very distinct, and it really does encapsulate the sense of atmosphere that this journey that you're going on is. And I think they've done a really great job here, and it really is just a distinctive atmosphere from its visuals and world design that bring a sense of world building to life. Whilst the soundtrack for Metaphor ReFantazio is a large component of this atmosphere, I feel the vocal performances for the cast of this game help to convey that sense of feeling and emotion in the writing. I think the characters like Stroll and the voice performances of his actor Stuart Clark in the English dub was just one example that springs to mind when I think of really well articulated characters and really like strong personalities that come to life, and ones I really want to get to know more of when I was playing through this game. But the casting and vocal performances for all of these characters are great and truly in a realm of their own in terms of visuals and sound presentation. Atlus and Studio Zero have absolutely nailed it here and brought every region, landscape, character, and personality to life in every facet of their visual and sound presentation, and it just goes to show why they're at the top of their game and regarded so highly in these two departments in particular. So to bring this whole review together, Metaphor ReFantazio is a remarkable experience in every regard, and is a statement that not only there is still a demand for turn-based RPGs, but more broadly, that this fantasy RPG still is something that people are hungering for. It tells an excellent narrative that is filled to the brim with subtext and undertones that only become more perceptible as the journey unfolds. The world of Uchronia is brimming with history, culture, conflict, and character, and this globe-trotting adventure for the throne is one that's sure to invoke some sense of wonder as its narrative and world unfold before you. For the team at Studio Zero and more broadly Atlus, it is a success that shows them learning from both SMT and Persona, and what makes these types of experiences so engaging maps on more broadly to these different ideas and worlds that they can envision, and that this route of exploring something new has created a universe that has, for me, now become just as beloved, and Metaphor ReFantazio has enshrined itself as another pillar alongside SMT and Persona in their excellent portfolio of video games. The hardest thing I've had to do surrounding this game is put off my second playthrough to write this review. I've been loving this game, and it is truly a beautiful RPG and experience that is compact more tightly as an experience that encapsulates all the social elements of a Persona game, and in ways that feel rewarding, and its combat is so satisfying that it feels like it takes all the stronger aspects of an SMT game, and with their brand new archetype progressions, their new free flow combat, their new ways of and versatile dungeons that you can explore, there is so much here in this 80-hour epic that feels fresh and new and distinct to Metaphor itself. Metaphor ReFantazio is a fantastic video game, and I absolutely recommend this game. Whether you're a Persona fan, Atlus fan, SMT, no matter what you're playing, I recommend you. Even if you're just a fan of old RPGs, Metaphor has something for you. The world of Uchronia and the race for the throne is an unforgettable experience, and for that reason, I believe Metaphor ReFantazio most certainly is my game of the year, and one you must play. There is a free demo that gives you the first 5 hours of this game, and there is no reason not to check this out, and I highly recommend you do, because I loved this game. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.